You sit down to lunch feeling fine. Hungry maybe, but functional. Alert, ready for the afternoon. You eat, and then somewhere between 40 minutes and 2 hours later, something happens that you have experienced so many times you have probably stopped questioning it. A wave of fatigue that is almost physical in its weight. Your eyelids feel heavy. Your thinking slows. Concentration becomes an act of will rather than a natural state. If you could lie down right now, you would. You push through because you have to. You reach for coffee. You tell yourself it is normal. And it is common, extraordinarily common, but normal is not the same thing as inevitable. What you are experiencing after eating is not a fixed consequence of digestion. It is a biological response to specific things happening in your blood, your brain, your nervous system, and your hormonal system in the hours following your meal. And every single one of those things is influenced by what you ate, how much you ate, when you ate, and in what order. The post-meal energy crash is not something that happens to you. It is something your biology produces under specific conditions. Understanding those conditions is the difference between an afternoon that collapses into fog and an afternoon that runs as well as your morning. The first and most widely discussed mechanism is the blood glucose spike and crash, but almost nobody explains it accurately enough to be useful. When you eat carbohydrates, particularly refined carbohydrates like white bread, white rice, pasta, sugary drinks, or anything made with processed flour and added sugar, your digestive system breaks them down rapidly into glucose. This glucose enters your bloodstream quickly, producing a sharp spike in blood sugar. Your pancreas detects this spike and releases a proportionally large insulin response to manage it. Insulin drives glucose from your bloodstream into your cells. But insulin does not modulate itself perfectly to the exact amount of glucose present. In people whose pancreatic response has become slightly overzealous from years of high carbohydrate eating, the insulin response can be disproportionately large relative to the glucose load. The result is that blood glucose drops below its pre-meal baseline into a state called reactive hypoglycemia. Your brain, which depends on a continuous and stable glucose supply, detects this drop and interprets it as an energy emergency. Cortisol and adrenaline are released to mobilize glucose from your liver and fat stores. But in the meantime, before these compensatory mechanisms fully restore blood glucose, your brain is running on a reduced supply. The subjective experience of this state is exactly what post-meal fatigue feels like: heavy, foggy, slow, unmotivated. You are not tired because you ate. You are tired because your blood sugar spiked and then crashed, and your brain is temporarily underfueled in the period between the crash and the recovery. The foods that produce this response most reliably are the ones that are digested and absorbed fastest: refined grains, sugary foods, fruit juices, anything with a high glycemic index, and minimal fiber, protein, or fat to slow absorption. The second mechanism is the one that surprises most people, because it involves a hormone they associate with happiness rather than fatigue: serotonin. Your gut produces approximately 90% of your body's serotonin. When you eat carbohydrates, particularly starchy ones, you trigger an insulin response that does something specific to amino acid transport across your blood-brain barrier. Most amino acids compete with tryptophan, the precursor to serotonin, for the same transport proteins to cross from your bloodstream into your brain. When insulin is elevated, it drives these competing amino acids into muscle tissue, leaving tryptophan with significantly less competition for brain entry. More tryptophan crosses the blood-brain barrier. More serotonin is synthesized in your brain. Serotonin itself is not sedating, but it is the direct precursor to melatonin, your primary sleep hormone. And elevated brain serotonin shifts your neurological state toward calm, reduced arousal, and drowsiness. This is why carbohydrate-heavy meals produce a qualitatively different kind of fatigue than protein-heavy meals. The carbohydrate fatigue has a warm, heavy, sleepy quality, because it is driven partly by elevated serotonin and melatonin precursor availability. Your brain is being told through the neurochemistry of your meal that it is time to rest. This mechanism is also why eating carbohydrates in the evening promotes sleep, while eating them at lunch devastates your afternoon productivity. The same neurochemical shift that is helpful at 10 p.m. is catastrophic at 1 p.m. The third mechanism operates through your autonomic nervous system and the extraordinary metabolic demand that digestion places on your body's resources. Digesting a meal, particularly a large one, is genuinely demanding biological work. Your digestive system requires increased blood flow to process food efficiently. Your stomach needs it for mechanical churning and acid secretion. Your small intestine needs it for nutrient absorption. Your liver needs it to process the flood of nutrients arriving through the portal vein. To meet this demand, your body redirects blood flow from peripheral systems, including your brain's cortical regions and your skeletal muscles, towards your gastrointestinal tract. This redistribution is mediated by your parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest branch, which activates strongly after eating to support digestive function. The activation of your parasympathetic system and the relative reduction in blood flow to your cortex produces a genuine reduction in cognitive alertness and physical energy. This is not a malfunction. It is your body appropriately allocating resources to the immediate biological priority, which is processing the meal you just consumed. But the magnitude of this effect is directly proportional to the size of your meal. A large meal demands a large blood flow redistribution. A moderate meal demands a moderate one. This is one of the most powerful arguments for eating moderate meal sizes rather than large ones, not for caloric reasons, but because the autonomic nervous system response to a large meal is one of the primary drivers of severe post-meal fatigue. The fourth mechanism involves cholecystokinin, CCK, the hormone your small intestine releases in response to fat and protein. CCK is a satiety hormone, but it also acts directly on your vagus nerve to activate the parasympathetic nervous system. When CCK binds to vagal receptors, it produces what researchers call the CCK-induced satiety response, which includes not just reduced appetite, but also drowsiness, reduced locomotor activity, and a general shift toward quiescent behavior. Evolutionarily, this made perfect sense. After a large meal, the safest and most metabolically efficient thing a prey animal could do was find a safe place to rest and allow digestion to proceed undisturbed. The CCK vagal signal was the biological instruction to do exactly that. In modern humans, eating large, fat, and protein-rich meals at midday, while required to remain cognitively productive for another 6 hours, this ancient mechanism produces the afternoon crash that coffee is invented to temporarily override. The fifth mechanism is specific to people with any degree of insulin resistance, which, given modern dietary patterns, is the majority of adults to varying degrees. In insulin-resistant individuals, the pancreatic response to a meal is not just larger than necessary, it is sustained for longer. Insulin stays elevated well beyond the period when blood glucose has normalized, continuing to drive glucose into cells and suppressing fat mobilization for hours after eating. This prolonged insulin elevation extends the reactive hypoglycemia window and delays the recovery of stable blood glucose. It also suppresses the release of orexin, a neurotransmitter produced in the hypothalamus that promotes wakefulness and drives alert, goal-directed behavior. In insulin-resistant individuals, the post-meal orexin suppression is more severe and more prolonged than in insulin-sensitive individuals, producing a deeper and longer post-meal cognitive crash. This is why post-meal fatigue tends to worsen over the years in people who are developing metabolic syndrome. The insulin resistance is amplifying a mechanism that was always present and making it increasingly difficult to maintain afternoon function. Here is what changes everything. The post-meal crash is not an inevitable consequence of eating. It is a consequence of eating in a way that maximizes the five mechanisms described above simultaneously. A meal that is high in refined carbohydrates, large in volume, eaten quickly, and consumed at a time when your circadian insulin sensitivity is already declining will trigger all five mechanisms at full intensity. A meal constructed differently, moderate in size, built around protein and fiber first, with carbohydrates last, eaten slowly over 20 minutes, and consumed earlier in the day when insulin sensitivity is highest, will trigger the same mechanisms at a fraction of their intensity. The blood glucose spike is blunted. The insulin response is proportional. The serotonin shift is modest. The blood flow redistribution is smaller. The CCK vagal response is appropriate. The result is not no fatigue. Some post-meal parasympathetic activation is normal and healthy. But that wave that crushes your afternoon becomes a gentle tide that asks for 20 minutes of calm rather than 2 hours of fog. Protein at every meal is the single most powerful lever. Protein slows gastric emptying, blunts the glucose spike, and does not trigger the tryptophan, serotonin, melatonin cascade that carbohydrates do. A lunch built around protein and vegetables, with carbohydrates as a smaller secondary component, will produce dramatically less post-meal fatigue than the same caloric lunch built around pasta or bread. Meal size is the second lever. Eating until you are satisfied rather than full halves the autonomic nervous system response and cuts the CCK vagal activation significantly. Muscle contraction pulls glucose directly from your bloodstream through GLUT4 transporters, flattening the glucose curve and reducing the insulin response before it peaks. These are not minor adjustments. They are the difference between an afternoon that functions and one that does not. Your post-meal exhaustion is your body's most direct signal about how you are fueling it. It is not telling you that eating makes you tired. It is telling you that something specific about this meal in this quantity at this time triggered a cascade that your brain cannot work through. Read that signal. Adjust the meal. The energy you want in the afternoon is not in another cup of coffee. It is in the meal you ate 2 hours before. If this changed how you understand what your food is doing to your energy, subscribe to this channel. Every video here goes inside the exact mechanism so you stop accepting as normal what your body has been telling you is correctable. Like this video and share it with someone who reaches for coffee every afternoon without realizing their lunch is the problem.